sure if someone else. Okay, thank you guys so much for coming today. I'm so excited to interview this incredible group of thought leaders. I think we'll do a quick introduction of ourselves. So my name is Sinead Bovell. As she mentioned, I'm the founder of Waye, an organization that helps prepare the next generation of workers for the digital future, so a future in which a lot of the jobs we see today will be replaced by tech. And I'm also a co-Model Mafia activist with Cameron Russell.
Oh, hello. My name is Semaan. I'm the founder of Slow Factory, a lab and focused on sustainable fashion and demanufacturing and responsible sourcing. I also run a conference series called Study Hall, which is about sustainability literacy, and it's in collaboration with the United Nations.
Hi, everyone. My name is Lilian. I've worked in sustainability and sustainable fashion for the past 10 years. Right now, I'm at the UN working to help companies become more sustainable in terms of business and operations. Worked for a number of nonprofits in the space, as well as brands, and super excited to be here.
Hi, everyone. My name is Hawa Arsala. I am a freelance creative director and strategist. A lot of my work is concerned with the conscious consumption and production of culture. And I am also a freelance consultant at Viacom, working on thought leadership projects there in the media world.
Hi, my name is Cameron Russell. I have been a model for 16 years, and I'm the co-founder and one of the lead organizers of Model Mafia, which is hundreds of models working together for a more just and sustainable industry and world. I'm currently working on a book about fashion, power, and intuition. And yeah, that's it.
Okay, awesome. So to get started, I think we need to redefine how we think about sustainability. And Céline, I know in a recent article with The Cut, you wrote, being able to afford that $600 sweater is not what defines sustainability. It's a cultural movement based on the way you consume. And I want you to unpack that quote for us, because I think it's a very powerful sentence.
So oftentimes we think that sustainability is something we can buy our way into. We can purchase something and therefore we can become more sustainable. And I believe that, in fact, buying our way into the movement is not effective enough. It's not if you are going to purchase something that's more expensive, that's by default you are becoming more sustainable. Sustainability has an issue with accessibility. Who is allowed to be sustainable today? How can we be sustainable if, in fact, the price tag of the items that we judge sustainable are above any kind of bracket that anyone can afford? I always encourage people to, when they think about sustainability, not to imagine that they can vote with their dollars or buy their way into it. In fact, oftentimes it's about not purchasing. It's about repairing instead. It's about extending the life cycle of your items. Instead of buying, I know we're like in a shopping situation, but it is oftentimes what you buy, how long are you going to keep it, whether it's going to be $20 or $50. Of course, if you can afford to buy something that's well-made, that's fair trade, that has respected both the earth and the people in its creation, then yes, by any means, buy that $600 sweater. But most of the time, when we put that bar so high, we are by default eliminating, 90% of people that aren't going to be able to embrace sustainability, and sustainability should be accessible.
And I think when you look at the true intersection of culture, fashion, and sustainability, you see that communities around the world have been practicing sustainability for years, but it's because they can't afford to live any other lifestyle. So where you have parents or grandparents making your clothes, and then that goes to your siblings, your cousins, your neighbors, it gets passed down through the chain. And I know, Cameron, you speak a lot about this on your social media. The need for us to redefine fashion, or to expand what we think of as fashion, not just the things we can buy, but the things that we can't. So talk to us a little bit more about this and why it's so important that we change this definition.
Sure. So after working in fashion for a long time, I always kind of felt like I was an outsider to that, or that I grew up in a family that wasn't particularly fashionable or didn't care about fashion. I was home visiting my mom, and she was going through like 40 years of sweaters that she had knit. And we grew up wearing clothes that she made and sweaters that she had knit. And it just struck me that I had been experiencing fashion as if, you know, like you walk into the Met and think that you've seen all art, rather than thinking there is art everywhere. Fashion is everywhere. It's in every culture. And what we understand as fashion should not just be what's in Paris and New York and Milan, when every place else gets to be apparel. That's ludicrous and racist. And so when I think about sustainable fashion, I think we have to bring back a lot of our understanding of where fashion comes from and what purpose it serves, and that it's not just this commodity, that it really is culture, and it's things that we make with our hands that show where we come from or who we love. Those things are so important and can replace consumption without eliminating fashion.
Yeah. And Hawa, I know you have been a creative director for projects with Nike, Glossier. You've had movies that have screened in Gucci. So to say that you understand culture as a currency is an understatement. So how then do we raise the value of true sustainable fashion as a currency in culture? How do we make it cool without it also leading to cultural appropriation by the fashion giants?
Yeah, that's actually a really big question that I've been grappling with a lot lately. And I had somebody recently ask me, if you had a dream project, what would it be? And I said, to brand climate change. But just the idea that we need to understand what the processes of consumption are right now, currently as they exist. And I'm a believer of dismantling systems from within as well as from outside. And so when I think about how consumption works or how cool is created, we have to start with, first of all, baseline. How do we create systems that are harmonious? How do we create systems that are not harming others or other systems, other people? And thinking about how to manufacture cool for something like sustainability or what that conversation means, to me, it's not just about the planet or the industry. It's also about the way that we treat each other. It's about the way that we understand different narratives and stories. And so with something like appropriation or thinking about how women of color really drive this industry and are driving the conversations around it, if we just look at this panel, and yet have very little stake in it, but are also active in cleaning up the sort of mess of what's happening with consumption and manufacturing right now. We just have to uplift our stories and be visible as a baseline to me. And so in a lot of my work, I try and center women of color and queer women of color specifically, because to start reframing consciousness, we need to start introducing new symbols and new codes of meaning into whether it's fashion, whether it's banking and finance, across all industries, so that we can help people understand that it starts with the self, it starts with the human first, and then there can be sort of a trickle effect from there on.
And for a takeaway from that, if we're to action on that, does that mean we should be looking out for the underrepresented producer, for example, or the underrepresented designer, and helping to lift them up, get them in the pages of the magazines, the covers of the magazines, to really bring their story forward?
Yeah, and in a lot of ways, I speak about power in the same way, because power is such a big concept, but it is so true in this world and in this intersection of sustainability and fashion specifically, but that if you are in a position of power, to give up some of that power or find ways of redistributing it so that we are including more voices in the decision-making process, that we're not working with the same influencers or the same thought leaders, but that we're really searching for ways to cultivate new modes of thinking, you know, not just sort of circulating the same cycles of thought.
And my next question is for either Lilian or Cameron, because I know both of you address this. And I know we're doing a lot of redefining here. But I think it's important, and especially in the West, for us to expand our definition of sustainability, because we often think about the planet and climate change, but there's an equally, if not more, urgent crisis in sustainability, and that's the labor or human rights issue. And so for either of you, why is it so important that we ensure that accurate and fair wages are applied across the entire supply chain, and making that a part of the sustainability story?
I'm happy to have a go at that. Well, I mean, I think what's exciting is that the conversation around what sustainability is and what sustainable fashion is changing a lot. I think if you compare today to even 10 years ago when I first started working in this area, you have a lot more of a holistic approach to it, and you actually think about, human rights. You think about the whole value chain and the people who made this piece, but you also think about what is the fabric made of? Is this a sustainable fabric? And where is it coming from? So there's a lot more angles that you're considering as a brand if you want to be sustainable today. Everything from environmental to social to human rights to transparency. And I think it's empowering that now we have a lot more information, a lot more data, which can also help us to make more informed decisions. So why is it important to look at human rights and labor rights? I mean, fashion is an economic giant, right, as an industry. So even in developing countries, you have, it's an employer of many, many people. And even just looking at the artisans, like that sector, the craft sector. I was at another panel earlier this week at the UN, actually, and we were looking at crafts and the importance of empowering artisans. And you think that that's a small industry, but the artisan industry is actually the second largest after agriculture in developing economies. So that means that, fashion as an industry has a lot of impact, also in the global north, the global south, and can improve many, many lives around the world. So if we make sure to pay people more fairly, and we are, I think a lot of the times consumers aren't saying that they don't want to pay people fair wages. It's a lot of the times that they don't know. Mm-hmm. But if you can be more transparent about, where is this piece actually coming from, then I will also have empathy and I will, be okay with paying that premium. Mm-hmm. It's like when you're going to a coffee shop and you always want to tip that person that you know, and you're fine with that and you're happy to pay that kind of premium. So same thing when it comes to the fashion that you're buying. I mean, if you have no feeling or connection to whoever made that piece, then it feels a bit too far away.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and do you have anything that you want to add to that?
I mean, all of that, yeah. I mean, I think if we had a switch that we could flick that sucks all the carbon dioxide out of the world, there is still the reality that we got here because of the extractive nature of capitalism. Mm-hmm. So we have to change that, and it's hurting people as well. It's hurting, the whole way that we have designed this system is not sustainable, and it's not just because sort of this existential and immediate threat that climate has. It's all these pieces going on at the same time. Mm-hmm. And I think frequently we have a very limited sustainability conversation in fashion because we don't want to challenge the system. We don't want to challenge the structure. We want to have sustainable business models and then sustainable fashion. Mm-hmm. But the reality is that we actually don't really have that choice. Mm-hmm. We have to change. Mm-hmm. Our hand is going to be forced. Mm-hmm. And so if you know that you have to change, it seems to me that the best way forward is the most inclusive way. Mm-hmm. So I echo everything you said. I think that is the really our only choice is to include labor and include even how Hawa was speaking, to include culture. We want to sustain culture beyond consumerism. There is culture. Mm-hmm. And a lot of what fashion is moments like this. This is fashion, but none of us are buying anything right now. Mm-hmm. It's events. Mm-hmm. It's human interaction. And it's all these other things beyond just buying
transaction.
Stuff.
Mm-hmm. And I think we're often quick to point the finger at fast fashion, but the issues with labor and human rights are pretty equal across the board. Just last year, Versace and Valentino were called out by the UK Parliament for not complying with the Modern Slavery Act. To not comply with that act, which is pretty baseline, you're doing some pretty extreme stuff. So it can be all lanes. It's not just fast fashion. Right. And I think the issue of labor and human rights, it's part of a bigger story, and that's colonialism. And I know you wrote a great article, and you talked about the trade routes. And if you're to look at the trade routes of the major fashion retailers, they're pretty much the same as they were in the height of European colonial exploitation. So for us to really challenge this, it means we're going against 500 years of systemic history in the wrong direction. How do we take that on? Where do we start? And who do we need to get on board?
So oftentimes I'm invited to talk about what's obvious, which is the elephant in the room, It's a very difficult task because talking about colonialism is not welcome and it's awkward. But today I'm wearing red because today is May 5th, and it marks the commemoration of indigenous women who are being murdered and being kidnapped and who are missing. And when we talk about these issues, again, what you were saying, sustainability is a culture with a capital C. It was actually the theme of our recent study hall. So study hall is a conference series in collaboration with the United Nations. And recently we had a study hall in London, and we discussed these issues about colonialism, trade routes, supply chain. Today, they map identically to colonial routes, so which means the way that we have designed our system is on exploitation, both of labor and of resources. And when we do look at this and we do observe it with the lens of, okay, let's redesign this system so that it matches our values, then where do we start? Where do we begin? And I think there is a shift in power that needs to happen where, A, we embrace discomfort. We are able to understand and hear these conversations without feeling triggered or without feeling like you must defend a thing or another. We have to discuss this because we have, you know, according to the United Nations report on climate change, we have under 10 years. So another report was issued where they were saying we have 5 years to begin to work together, which means all nations working together before we come up with a solution. So a shift in power is important when we are looking at redesigning of the system. Then who is responsible of this unsustainable, you know, world? Who is responsible today? Let's not look at the past, let's just look at today. What can corporations, brands, organizations do today, every single month, you know, incrementally, create goals or follow the sustainable development goals that the United Nations has, you know, designed for everyone to be inspired by. Maybe if we follow these goals and sort of created design briefs to match these goals. So for instance, if we want to look at no poverty, well, we have to look beyond fair wages or living wages. In fact, living wages, when we look at them today, there aren't living wages because we are living, like the people who are, you know, we are addressing them as living wages are living in extreme poverty today. So we don't want to sustain that. We don't want to sustain the way that we are producing, manufacturing, consuming, because if we did want to sustain that, today we need 1.7 Earths to sustain what we have today, which is already unsustainable. So what we want to sustain, what is it that we want to sustain? What kind of lifestyles do we want to sustain? And I really think that it goes to redesigning and redefining what we mean when we talk about sustainability and what is it that we're trying to sustain. And it's a larger conversation. It is about culture. It is about government policies. And the more we discuss it, the more we are able to analyze it together and come up with solutions that are top-down and bottom-up.
And I think, and one thing that you touched on, and I know other incredible activists like Renee Peters, who's in our Model Mafia Association, just the mere fact that we can talk about sustainability, that means we're a lot more privileged than the majority of the people of the planet that can't even access this conversation. So knowing that, what does that mean for us? That we can't just stop at an individual level to make these individual changes. It has to be at the corporate level. It has to be at the government and the federal level, because the majority of the planet doesn't have the opportunity to adjust anything, yet alone even know this type of information.
Correct.
And Hawa, I know you had posted for this event specifically that you were excited to talk about the various steps of engagement on sustainability that often do more harm than good. For example, greenwashing. So I think that that's a pretty important concept and area. Can you walk us through that and how we as consumers can educate ourselves on that to know how to avoid these surface level kind of versions of sustainability?
Right. So I guess as a baseline, greenwashing is taking language or thought around a movement like sustainability or, I don't know, certain practices and principles and infusing marketing and branding efforts with that to sort of sell to people the idea of sustainability, but perhaps not practicing it wholly and fulfilling the, I guess, to the level of sustainable development goals. You know, it's just not happening to that level because it's marketing at the end of the day, but how to have proper marketing that bleeds into the actual practice of that is a different story. There are brands out there who use this model, whether it's transparency or otherwise, to sell products and to put more stuff out into the world, which in itself is not actually sustainable, without saying any names. We've all tweeted and Instagrammed about it, so if you want to know more. But yeah, I think it's really important for people to have an awareness about what sustainability actually means and how to be conscious consumers, and that you might be sold a product or something that is sustainable, but what is the process of actually understanding, and how do you look for what it truly means for a brand to be sustainable? Do you go to their About section? Do you see if they link to their artisans or their creators or makers in any sort of way? I think that, and there are so many resources out there, just Google it, of how to find out if a brand is actually truly sustainable or is making an authentic effort to be sustainable rather than using it for marketing. And I think consumers now are smarter than ever, and they understand when they're being sold to. But I think what allows people to make that purchasing decision is the cool factor that exists around something, and that influencers and culture creators and producers are implicit in that and complicit in that. And so I think there needs to be a sort of awakening moment where people kind of refuse to, take products and make them cool because there is a cool factor attached to it, but how do we make wearing the same thing for a week or a year cool? There was a blog of a woman who wore like a dress for a year in so many different ways.
I think that was my old boss.
Was that? Yeah.
She wore a black dress in
I remember
different
that.
ways for like 365.
That was my introduction to sustainability.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
I have to tell her that.
Yeah, you have to tell it.
Hopefully she's watching.
And I think, and Cameron, I know your experience with this being in fashion, some of the most influential people in the world exist in fashion, and they have the power to change the entire direction of a culture through something as simple as a tweet or an Instagram post. How do we leverage fashion to make an impact to reverse climate change, not just within our industry, but for the world at large? How do we take this platform, which is inherently culture, and use it to change the direction of how we're evolving?
That's a great question. I think I'm going to veer off the path of talking about influencers, but I can come back to that if people are interested. So the fashion industry is like 80% women, right? But women are never in charge. So if we think like, who's got the power to change, to turn this boat? Like, is it the 4 billionaires that own 90% of fashion? They're probably not going to shift that much because they're really invested in what's happening. It's working for them. So the 80% of the industry that's women who happen to never be in charge, the solution that I'm working on now and that I believe in is that by organizing and by knowing each other and by working together across the entire supply chain, so that means like retail workers, garment workers, people in export processing zone, models, creatives, all of these women need to be in conversation because we're the ones who are going to be able to turn the boat. And it's so important because fashion, which I think frequently is kind of the end of the list of like concerns when we think about climate change, we're thinking like we got to stop driving our cars, but actually the fashion industry is right behind the transportation industry in terms of emissions, and it's the second biggest polluter of waterways. So this is a really central industry when we want to affect climate, and so I believe it's through organizing that we're going to get there. A piece of that organizing, a small tiny bit of the iceberg, is influencers, and so I hope that I role model a little bit of that in terms of the women who do have visibility in this industry should be doing as much as they can to actually turn that light on all the other women leaders. For a long time as a model, I thought that I believed all the sort of sexist things about models, that we are pretty and our jobs are completely useless and we have nothing else to offer. And that's not true. I had to turn myself around. Partly I did that through binge reading every single model autobiography ever. And models are incredibly leaderful. I encourage everybody to read Iman's autobiography and learn how in the early 90s she deconstructs everything that we're talking about right now. That's not leadership that we hear of, mostly because we are really good at disappearing the leadership of women, and especially women of color. And so I think there is a ton of leadership potential, and power that we can wield together. And that's at least where I see the solution coming from.
Yeah, very, very powerful. And so I think to end this, each of you as creators of culture and makers of culture, what are you doing specifically to ensure that fashion moves on the right side of history?
Can I just piggyback a little bit on what you're saying? I coined the term fashion activism, which means that fashion has the power to change culture. Fashion creates culture, and culture can very much create action. And a bit just what you were saying, that every one of us can use this medium as a medium for social and environmental change. You know, like maybe you want to just say what you're doing.
I mean, I think, you know, in my work, I try to, because fashion is so global and local at the same time, right? You have such massive value chains. You have these kind of, you know, 90% of the big guys that own everything, and then you have all these people that are voiceless, oftentimes. And I think, to me, being at the UN, it's a responsibility as well to work with governments on the policy side. I mean, we have barely discussed, you know, the importance of also kind of direction, right, from the government, because, yeah, those guys that own everything are not going to change unless they have to. So we can push as much as we want, and it's going to, we'll see some change, and we've already seen some, but I think to have that kind of large-scale systems change, I mean, you need to work with the governments as well. So you know, to me, it's exciting. I mean, you know, for example, you mentioned the UK. I mean, their environmental audit committee went in and said, look, how do we end the era of fast fashion? And they went to the Parliament House, and now they're coming out with a bunch of recommendations that are actually gonna hold companies more accountable in terms of the environment, in terms of human rights. So I think it's like a difficult stakeholder to touch in a way. Like, if I haven't studied policy, like, what do I do as like an individual person? But I think really getting informed, I mean, both in terms of what are the data, like making science-based decisions, but also informing yourself about the brand. So are there any certifications in this brand that make it more sustainable, or are they just saying that they're sustainable? I mean, looking for the actual data and the actual kind of third parties that also have gone in and verified things, while at the same time telling the people that, you know, the policymakers are trying to create better communities, and those communities are you guys, right? That's us. So they're working for us, right? So we can tell them what we need and what we want. So being informed, like I would say, inform yourself, look at science, and try to, you know, make your opinion heard around these issues to the right people, I would say.
Yeah, very powerful. What about you?
For me, I think my comfort zone and my flavor of change making is in this space of what I like to talk about, invisible labor. I'm more so comfortable in the behind the scenes, in the very in the boardroom meetings, or in the if I'm on set for a campaign or something like that, in the decision-making process that happens behind the scenes in the marketing and branding world, because to me, symbolic change is my level of comfort, and the way to do that is by informing decision makers and having close proximity to them in order to be able to sort of pass on this lineage of thought, and to be in a position where I'm trusted for that. It feels like a really great responsibility. And so to me, it's not just about, you know, the direct action that can be done, but also in the simple conversations that are happening between you and maybe a loved one, or you and a coworker, or you and a manager, or even walking into a retail store, the conversations that you're having every day. It's sort of like a lifestyle that's built into the way that I live, think, and speak. And also to coalition builds, like Cameron was talking about, how we're thinking about building across different systems and sectors and things like that. If someone were to cast this panel, I don't think they would have brought me into the loop, because my work isn't visibly about sustainability, but I think about it a lot, and it informs my work a lot. And I think it's important for us to coalition build with people who are coming at it from different angles or who are thinking about it in ways that aren't normally seen in the world. And so I always try and make sure that I'm giving a leg up to people who don't have access to this conversation or am inviting them into it in some way. So thank you for the invitation.
Very good. And what about you, Cameron? And I know you shared some of the credible
Yeah,
stuff
I mean,
you've already
organizing
done.
is probably my first answer. I guess to build on where Hawa just left off, I feel like there's a lot to be said for understanding sustainability in a really holistic way. And I think finding the front line wherever you are that is going to sustain you, that is going to sustain your community, that is sustaining, that is the work. Also, I think something like 100 corporations are responsible for 70% of emissions, so we have to really like antagonize those guys. And then I think part of that is this sustaining piece that will grow leadership, will make space for people to do the things that it's going to take to move us into that future. And so when we think about like, you know, is it important that I, you know, ensure that my neighbors are doing well? Is that tied to sustainability? For me, it really is. Even if that isn't, the actions that you take there are not specifically about CO2 emissions, there's all these pieces of the ecosystem that have to change. And so I think trying to understand that holistically and find your front line. So for me in fashion, the front line a year ago was talking about abuse and harassment of models and of women in our industry at large. That is tied into sustainability for me because women have to lead. Women are the most affected by climate change. So when we are just putting all these puzzle pieces together, I think no matter where you sit and what your job is, you can start acting in a way that is towards sustainability just by looking for that front line, whatever it is.
I think it's also about education. Like the more you know, the more you can act. That was you were saying, seek scientific data, but sustainability literacy or access to sustainable information or sustainability is something I focus on a lot with my non-for-profit called Study Hall, and it's the library.eco if you want to look at any kind of content around sustainability, whether it's about culture, about society, about supply chain, or about materials. Each conference that we do is about sustainability, literacy, access to this information. It's all free and it's live streamed, and a lot of reports and data are later on written around each conference. And accessing this type of talks and this type of information, I think, can help not just now by like, oh, okay, I'm going to understand colonialism or I'm going to understand that certain materials are bad for the environment, but the more you know, the more it can inform your decisions because you can, unfortunately, you are purchasing your way into this. I know we started by saying you don't purchase your way into it, but you are purchasing your way into it because right now the way that we can create change as a consumer is choosing where you put your money and how you decide to invest. And so the more you know, it kind of informs your purchase decisions, and you can, also share the knowledge with other people. And we were just saying in the beginning that this is fashion as well. Like learning is fashionable, and the climate change is sexy, and like we should be learning a lot more into, or leaning into education, leaning into the unknown a lot more than we allow ourselves to.
And I think it's no coincidence that the conversation we're having right now is quite similar to the conversations we have in technology, in pharma, and healthcare. There's a few giants that are leading the ship in a direction that's not sustainable. So I think now is a really good time to redefine our future. And through things like tech and things like education, I think we can point the ship in the right direction. It's about just being active and ensuring that everything you do, think critically of it and make sure it's moving on the right side of history. So with that, if we have time to open to questions, I don't know if we can do that, but if you have any questions for any of us, and we'll be around, probably not buying, but shopping, looking at the art. Okay. Awesome.
If there are no questions, can I say one more?
Yep.
I feel like we were really serious, but also all of us are super about joy. And like the sustainable future is joyful, and we're all here mostly because we really wanted to see each other and be in community with each other. and have this very, very real conversation in a public space. And it's ultimately, it's about building a future that we really enjoy and that we feel free in.
More joy.
And it's very intersectional and interdisciplinary, like you were saying. For instance, again, not trying to plug my study hall here, but but we do talk with scientists. We talk with. It's about indigenous knowledge. It's about going back to indigenous knowledge and wisdom and ancient wisdom. And right now we see a lot of like startups coming up with like biodegradable cutleries and biodegradable plates, and like this was made out of leaves and out of wood and out of wood waste and so on and so forth. So looking at the circular knowledge that was already part of our history and how we can bring it back in a more inclusive and diverse way that we've never seen before implemented. So.
Can I say a final thing as well?
Yes. Now you cannot shut us up.
Just ending on a note of optimism. I mean, I was, in these conversations, I try to think like, why are we really doing this? And do we actually believe that change will happen? And I think, the Students' Climate March, I think that brought together 1.6 million students. And that was 15th of March. And Fridays for Future is a thing now. Like, the kids are not going to school because they're protesting on Fridays. So, think about that for a minute, and those people will be voting very soon. So, I mean, to me, that is hope, and that is joy and optimism. So, change will come.
I agree. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks so much. Thanks, guys.